I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I record this podcast. I am on Yuggabal country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Hi Smart Community friends, and welcome back to this very special series here on the Smart Community Podcast, all about data storytelling. As part of my PhD research, I am speaking with experts from all over the world who are using data visualizations and storytelling in real-world projects to support decision-making and advocacy. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a fantastic chat with Dr. Phillip Gough. Phil is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. As a designer and a researcher, he focuses on building and evaluating interactive systems with particular expertise in biomaterials for a sustainable circular economy. In this episode, Phil tells us about his work with clinicians at Westmead Hospital, developing decision support tools for emergency department triage, and his collaboration with agricultural companies using satellite data to optimize cattle movements across Australia. Phil and I discussed the importance of understanding user workflows, the difference between effective or functional and affective or emotional data visualizations, and the challenges of working within existing technical constraints such as the software or platforms available to a particular organization or situation. We talk about the way data visualizations can both be playful or creative and purposeful and meaningful, plus the way data can be art or the concept of data physicalization. We finish our chat discussing Phil's perspective on making invisible information visible through visualization and his advice for exploring personal data through creative practice. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work and play with smart communities. The future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hi, Phil. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks.
That's great to hear. Let's just jump straight into this. And can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and some of the current projects you're working on.
Okay, my name's Dr. Phil Gough. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. I don't know anything about buildings, though. I'm from the design department. So we mostly do human-centered design, particularly focusing on interaction design, so how we build and evaluate interactive systems that are usable for the people that we are the intended audience. And so do a bit of teaching in that space, everything from 3D modeling to ethical and responsible design, so a range of things there. In my own research, I'm mostly looking at biomaterials and how, there's a bit of a mismatch between technology being made out of plastics and things like that that are going to be made and then around for centuries, even though the technology itself is obsolete in a year or 2 or 5. And considering those materials will last for centuries, I think there's a bit of a mismatch there. So biomaterials is one way that we could address that for a sustainable circular economy. And a big part of that is kind of working with science, which is what I've always done, working with scientists and collaborating with them and statisticians and computer scientists, which is where I kind of got my introduction to data visualization topics. So we're looking at visualization through technology and also through physicalization through some of these biomaterials as well.
Cool. Sounds so interesting. So let's dive into that a little deeper. I don't know if you want to select kind of either one project or talk broadly, but how do you, and I guess within your research and within the work you do in the university, use data visualization or storytelling?
So there's one project that is interesting because it highlights a couple of challenges and opportunities for design. where there was a group of us from the design department working with some clinicians at Westmead Hospital, and we were looking at how we could give information to nurses in a way that supports their decision-making. So one of the big challenges that we had when I was introduced to the project was that there was some statisticians kind of from the government department side who were building this AI model, and they just said, oh, we're going to give them the information because they're making decisions randomly. And the decision they were making was kind of important. It's the one who goes next in the emergency department. Like, there's the initial triage. If you're not familiar with an emergency department, you kind of register that you're there, and you show your Medicare card, all that kind of stuff. If you're coming in an ambulance, it's a different process. But most people, they show their Medicare card and they get an initial triage, which is basic vitals and things like that. And one of the problems at a hospital is actually acquiring sepsis, which is a pretty nasty condition to get. People do die from sepsis, and so it can be something that the hospitals really want to avoid, somebody developing sepsis. And when I got onto this project, they had this kind of anecdote that, somebody stubbed their toe, they think it might be broken, so they've gone to the emergency department. But because it's very low priority, and that's how the nurse chooses who goes next, is that priority, they might be sitting there for hours, but really they might have sepsis, was kind of the story they told. But unfortunately, like many health systems, there's no standard test for this particular condition. It's like a kind of a category of rather than a specific condition. And so the evaluation is basically based on information probably from returned GIs in the 1940s, when they were first doing, what happens when somebody has sepsis. They get a high fever. Well, we know that that's not the case because older people would have a low temperature rather than a high temperature. So there's a lot of those kind of things that on, the standard approach, the nurses know isn't actually correct, and they can look out for those things when they make their decisions. But it isn't captured in that data that they get. And so they were making this AI model to have a better representation of what actually happens to somebody within the demographics that they know about. So if you're male, female, older, younger, all those kind of things that are collected at that initial stage, there was an AI model that might say, you've got a pretty strong risk of having sepsis. And so I came onto this project at that stage. There was this AI model. It was going to give this list of all the people in the ED. And my role was to present that information in a way that supported decision-making. So they call these clinical decision support tools. But one thing that really stood out to me as a designer was that the difference between my approach, having a design background, versus the approach of the computer scientists who are working on the team. The first thing I thought to do was, well, can I go and stand behind the person in the ED who's going to be making the decision? Because there was a specific role at Westmead Hospital that isn't common among all hospitals. And so I did that. I went and stood behind them, and I came back with a list of notes and a whole bunch of sketches of how the data moves around that kind of space and that process. And I said, well, the AI model should be over there. This person shouldn't be making that decision. It should come over to that person. And so we came up against the technical challenges. The AI model hadn't had a chance to run, where I thought it should be. And if it was going to be in that place, there were other kind of logistical challenges. So how do you actually present it to that person? Because the workstation on wheels that this person works at, they have to log in. There's all these security things that you have to go through. And so to have a board just displaying this information wouldn't really be very helpful. Their idea was that they would have a tablet that they would just look at, but that didn't really fit the workflow of what that person does. And they've got to have an idea of, who's in the waiting room, and they can see that from the system that they have, but it doesn't tell them about this condition of sepsis that they thought was really important. So what we did was to actually reframe the problem, as we as designers often do, and said, well, the problem isn't really whether or not somebody has sepsis or not, because if somebody, there was a guy that was brought into the emergency, he didn't come in an ambulance, but he had, blood running down his face, and he went straight through. And of course he did, because that's how the system works. Even if somebody might have sepsis, they wouldn't necessarily be higher priority than this person who's been in some kind of accident and is bleeding profusely and stuff like that. So the question for us became, how do we represent and show data that says, hey, this person might not be in the right triage category? Because the nurses, that's their language. And so how can we kind of interpret this kind of computer science, what they call a risk stratified list of the patients in the ED, in the waiting room? How do we translate into language that the actual nurses understand and can make a decision based on that?
Yeah, wow. So we've covered how a very specific project, and which I love, and I love all of the detail. I can kind of see you standing there in the hospital, and I can see the people in the ER, people coming in, and then I guess kind of the solution of or changing the language is so powerful, which is something that might seem very minor, but actually is huge, because you're then using the language of the audience or the user that has to actually use it, which is so powerful, and actually working with them to design the system with them rather than just for them as well. Tell us a bit more about what then the solution ended up being.
Well, it was really around, we were kind of butting up against what we could do, and, some tension with what is possible within the system that we were working in. We had a group of bright students from computer science do a project with us, and this would have been really basic for them, but they actually built like a web app. Part of what they were building was actually the back end with all of the interoperable messaging systems, which is not really kind of relevant to what we were doing. They were kind of just facilitating that. But in terms of the front end, the user side, they built it with web tools, but we actually, when we presented it to them, we were told, well, the hospital or the team from kind of the New South Wales Health, they weren't going to hire someone to maintain that service, because that's not a supported platform, it's a bespoke one. And so they actually were using Tableau instead. So there was a lot of technical limitations that came with that, but it did allow things like having logins, which was, Tableau handed all of that kind of thing, so that the nurse could just use their own ID and log in like they would to any of their other systems. However, that caused some problems because we weren't able to have as much control as we would have liked in the presentation. And I guess one of the other things that we kind of had some tension with was more of an opportunity from the health system is it's kind of unique in that we know that everybody was going to have training, which normally, if it was a general audience, we wouldn't have. But anybody who's going to use this system, because the way that the health system works, somebody was going to train these people how to use this dashboard. And we did design it so that, and we did user testing, we did think alouds, and we did heuristic evaluations and things like that, which we normally would have done to make it as usable as possible. But we also knew that people were going to have that kind of training. So it was a different situation to what many of us designers are used to in that sense, because we knew that training was coming. And we also knew how the decision was made. And so we knew where to kind of inject that extra piece of information. But we ended up with this dashboard using a system that we couldn't really support. And the challenge with any of these things is then if they go from, say, Tableau to Microsoft Power BI, then you've got to make the argument all over again to rebuild that service in another platform. So there's a lot of those kind of challenges that came up that we're not really used to engaging with as designers. Whereas, some of the computer scientists and clinicians are more used to those sort of challenges.
Mm. You used the phrase heuristic evaluation. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So in terms of user evaluations, they would be done with the people who would be the person who's intended to use this product or service, whether it's a website or an app or any kind of service or system that you're building for someone. A heuristic evaluation is an evaluation against principles So not against somebody's experience, but it's also not done by the end user. It will be done by somebody who has expertise in either the domain of the activity that you're working on or in like design itself. So we used, rather than the very common set of Nielsen's heuristics, which most design students would be pretty familiar with, there's 10 heuristics. Things like, having a match between the system and the real world, recognition rather than recall, all these kind of things. There's these 10 principles that are very commonly used and are very robust for most interactive systems. And essentially the process is to either have a usability expert complete a task, like with a goal, like you would give a user for a think aloud, but you've got an expert going through that task and they're saying, this experience in some way violates principle number X. And you give a severity. It may be a minor violation of that principle, like it goes from 0, no violation at all. Minor violation, if we've got time, we might fix it, but it's not really an issue. Or it could go up to, usually they will go up to 4. So this is a huge catastrophic issue. We desperately need to fix this before we can launch the product. So it's a scale of how strongly something violates these predetermined principles. We used one that was from a paper that was specifically designed for information dashboards, and it was actually designed with health systems in mind. So it was really appropriate for us. And it includes some principles that are not generally applicable to interactive systems. So I can't remember the exact term that they use, but minimizing the data ink ratio. So having the most data to the fewest pixels rather than ink now, I guess. How can we efficiently do this? So we went through that in the design team. So we had some clinicians and some designers who actually went through the process of evaluating and completing those tasks that we ended up giving to users for the usability study.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm just thinking from like a data visualization perspective. So it's applying, if you're using a system, how user-friendly it is to use, and then I guess from a data visualization perspective, how easy, or it's probably not the right word, but how easy is it to get the information that you need from the system?
Yeah. So generally, like usability would be, how easy or how usable a service is in terms of somebody can complete it, but that somebody's not just anybody. There's a specific group of people you want to be able to undertake this, so they have a certain amount of knowledge that you can assume that they have. So we're looking at nurses. We're not looking at how well the general public would understand this. Also, how repetitive some of those issues might be. Is it something that you deal with once and then it doesn't matter ever again? Or is it something that's really persistent and then causes some frustration? So what are those responses that people have as well? So are they getting annoyed by the interface, or is it just something that they just automatically click through in order to get to where they need to go to complete that task?
And does that have I guess I'm thinking from a data visualization perspective, does that have any effect on then, I guess, how effective the system is in, usability is one thing, but then how useful that information is for that person as well. And is it easy? Yeah.
So I guess it really depends. Like if you want to talk generally about data visualization, I think it's important that it's not just effective. So it's good at presenting the information in a way that our, visual perception can interpret things, and it is also understandable. It meets those patterns that we expect to see, but it should also be affective. So effective and affective. So it should have some kind of connection to people in more broader terms for data visualization. So it needs to be, it could be meaningful, and that opens us up to do like a range of different kinds of things with data visualization. If you're doing an information dashboard for nurses, that's, you're not really worried about their kind of emotional response to this sort of thing. But if you want to appeal to someone to make a decision about their own health, or whether they want to change something to be, have a lower carbon footprint or something like that, those kind of things, you can make those appeals to, like, thinking like the classical rhetoric, appeal to somebody's virtues, somebody's logic sense, their or somebody's emotions as well. You can use data visualization to do those things as well.
Mm. Yeah, I guess that's where your audience is, and considering your audience, and I also guess considering the context of what decision needs to be made and why and how and when and who is really, really important. Yeah, that's super interesting. Now, you were talking earlier about having some of those limitations of, having to use Tableau instead of what you would want to use. I'm curious of, if you had free reign, what are some of those things that you would have changed or considered more from, like, I guess it would, let's just say, your best practice that you wanted to and how you wanted to achieve that. So what things would you have done a little differently?
Yeah. So in this particular project, we know a lot about the hardware that it's being run on. We know it's not going to be shown on a mobile device. So there's some of those, we're kind of fortunate that we don't have to have those considerations. I guess one of the key differences between Tableau and what we would have liked to do would be things like using standard web frameworks. We were visualizing health data, but we weren't really aggregating a lot of data. We were kind of showing an overview, but we weren't doing a lot of those things that might have needed, more complex charts that would have had to be custom made and things like that. They just were not really relevant to this particular health project. And so it would have been really effective for us to just use standard web applications, which then we weren't really considering accessibility as a major need, particularly when we got to Tableau and we don't really know how much control we had over that and those kind of questions. But if we were just using web frameworks, that wouldn't have been an issue because we could have just embedded all of that anyway. We could have had those kind of accessibility questions like being able to tab through the interface, for example. We could have had that from the start. Whereas with Tableau, it really restricts the decisions that we're able to make in that sense. Positioning of elements, even, all those kind of things are just more difficult because we were kind of cornered into using this one application. I have experience with using D3 as a JavaScript library, but it probably would have been overkill for this particular application. So, yeah, then in terms of best practice, I mean, a lot of the challenge comes from what the service the project is willing to pay for. And at that stage, we've got the people who've been trained to use Tableau, so they'll be the ones who will be building it.
Yeah, no, interesting. So from a decision-making perspective, has this project now made it easier, or has it changed the decision-making process for the nurses?
Yeah, this was a bit of an interesting part of this project, is because we were working with clinicians who have a background in implementation science. We actually looked at doing an implementation evaluation as well, which is something that we don't do in design very much. We kind of sit at one end and we understand what people need, we understand how to build things, and once we build something, we understand what happens when they try and complete their tasks. But design doesn't do a very good job of then saying, okay, how does it affect the way that people behave afterwards when you've released it out into the world? If you're, Meta or Reddit or, Spotify, if you've got a big app with millions of people, you can get that data. But for, I think, most applications, it's not very realistic for designers to be thinking about that kind of thing. What's actually interesting is in health, a lot of the human factors experts are looking at that kind of thing, but they don't do a very good job of what we do at the first stage, the way that we collect information about the person who'll be using it and understand what their needs, define those tasks and goals that they have. In the health system, it seems, and there's obviously people who do kind of this end-to-end approach, but the majority of things is something gets built and then they put it out in the wild, so to speak, and they see what happens. But they're very good at evaluating that. And we saw some really interesting behaviors because people were trying to understand the system by updating the system and seeing, how long does it take for somebody to actually move from being in the waiting room to going through the next stage of triage and then being seen by the medical officer. And then they were kind of, updating something on the computer system, then rushing over to where the dashboard was to see how long it would take to update and all those kind of things. And so they were kind of exploring this interface through that. And we really didn't expect that kind of behavior at all. But actually going through that process of seeing how it changed, what behaviors came up like that one that we didn't expect, was actually really interesting. And I think is probably an opportunity for design to go further and think about the way that these human factors experts are evaluating things in situ once they've been deployed.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's so interesting. And it's interesting just to see that interactivity when seemingly it's not interactive. Like, I assume the interface isn't super interactive, as in, I guess I haven't seen it, obviously, but like I'm thinking, they've like created like a way to be interactive with the system.
Yeah. I mean, it is, I guess it is an interactive system. Like it does take data from the user and it will update the display based on that. It's not just a presentation of like like a train thing where it just updates who the next person is. It will update the list. The user can actually find out more information about their vitals that isn't displayed by default. So there's a bit of the overview, zoom and filter, details on demand sort of thing that we want to have as part of our good practice in data visualization. We weren't able to grab as much of that information or integrate it as effectively as we would have liked to because of the constraints of Tableau. But being able to, dig into those kind of things. And they ask the kind of questions that we didn't think. And this is something that as a designer, I've seen a number of times. I mean, when I was still studying my thesis, I worked for NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology in the States for 6 months. As a designer, building some JavaScript visualizations. And I thought, I had this kind of histogram, had lots of colors and lots of different things that looked like they were going on. And I thought, well, there's the most contrast there. And so when I took it to the scientist who was actually going to be using this visualization and looking at this data, he'd been collecting the data set, I said, here's what it looks like. And he immediately clicked on something else that he found much more interesting, which to me, I couldn't really see that much. So it's interesting to actually kind of compare, my expectations as a designer. Like I knew what he wanted to get out of it and I could design for it because I spoke to him and the scientist and I was able to get his feedback on what he needed. But even then, a lot of my assumptions about what he would find interesting once everything was in place was quite different.
So do you think even, because I've been talking about interactivity as like a key or a desired element of visualization and storytelling, which sometimes isn't achievable and is like a lot more work. But I guess even just thinking about this from a click and zoom perspective, that is interactivity. And then it allows people to, find the thing that you, like it exists, but you didn't realize that was the thing they were going to kind of dive into as well. And that's really interesting, I think. Because I was thinking about interactivity as more from an emotional perspective. You moving data around, you feel more connected with the data, when you're showing that kind of big, maybe climate change or something like big topics. But then even from like a small perspective where you're not necessarily looking for an emotional response because you just need, they need data to make it better or a more informed decision. That interactivity is really important still.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess the same way that we think about other interfaces, having, people have an emotional response to everything. And, there's a lot of data visualization kind of philosophers, I guess, who say, who have pointed out that, no data visualization is neutral. There is no such thing. Whoever's designed it has put some perspective on it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so I guess it just depends on building trust with the person who's using it. So with a clinician, you want user, who is a clinician, to feel like you're taking it seriously as the designer. We're not using any weird fonts or anything like that. But also that it is there for them to do their job. Whereas, if you see a lot of what I would probably call creative data visualizations, there is a bit of that kind of meaning or emotion-based connection to draw people in. There's lots of examples of this. One of my favorite ones is If the Moon Were Only One Pixel. It's a really cute little website, which seems to be almost entirely made in CSS, which is the way it's put together seems quite impressive. But the story behind it was that the author's name I can't remember, I think was Josh Worth, talking to his young daughter saying, if we were going to drive down the coast, it would be very different to if we were going to travel to Mars, and trying to explain, the scale of distances in space. And so made this website as kind of a way of exploring that. And that kind of playfulness and fun, it doesn't need to exist. I think that sits separately from a lot of the data visualization that we see that is trying to do something. It doesn't have an objective. It just exists solely to be a piece of a creative work. And I think that's it creates a really interesting space for designers to work in.
Do you think that data visualizations can, from a creative works perspective, both be creative and have a real, I guess, imperative need, rather than just being can they both be playful and fun but also serving a purpose, I suppose?
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of creativity. Some people might define creativity as being kind of something new and different, but also something that has some element of surprise, something that you didn't expect. So you mentioned fun and playful, but some of the really creative ones might be one a project by a group called Periscopic, who visualized gun deaths. I think they did 2013 and 2015, maybe. There was 2 years that they did. And there is a statistical model that they, when they were talking about how they put it together, they said that they felt that they were really compelled to share the visualization because they just saw that there was so much time based on their statistical model that was stolen from gun violence in America in those 2 years. And so this visualization by Periscopic, I think, is very creative, but is not necessarily about fun and playfulness. There's a bit of surprise because you don't really expect, you have a real reaction to it. I think it's a very emotive visualization. I think it's got a very clear, a very well-defined, and a very strong message that is about, this loss of life and how tragic that is. But it is creative in the way that it represents that in a way that you respond to. And watching it, you feel like you want it to stop. And I think it is a very interesting example and kind of a case study of how powerful visualization can be because of the way that is represented in a way. And again, this is another visualization that doesn't need to exist, right? We can tell that story without, we can even tell the data without an individual visualization. But the statistical modeling that went into producing this project kind of spoke so strongly to the people working on it that they built the visualization out of it.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I'm just looking up. I have seen it before, but that animation piece and how you said, you kind of want it to stop, which is just such an emotional response to, nothing fun and playful about it, but it's creative, hard data, essentially. But having that emotional response to it is really interesting. And I guess that's the impact that the visualizations and stories can have. We talked about a couple of examples. Any other examples of impactful data visualizations or stories that have left an impression on you?
I think the ones that, which ones have left an impression on me? I think I really like the, I don't think they have necessarily had the same kind of emotional, visceral response that you have with the periscopic gun violence example. But a lot of the projects are like Dear Data and Data Sketches. So these two pairs of women who are practicing their data visualization and sharing these things, I think that had an effect on me in the way of like opening up to the purpose of what visualization can be and how there's this creative practice around producing data visualizations and kind of this. I'm not in the digital culture space, but kind of a culture around, making these and what the motivation for doing that is. And it opens up more avenues for me as a designer, which allows us to then think about, okay, what would be interesting to represent and what ways would be interesting to represent these things. They're in the digital space. I'm working a lot with biomaterials now when we're building up some projects related to data physicalization. So if we can have a visual representation of information which is embedded in a material, we're looking at building some of those projects now. I don't have one I can talk about yet. We're partway through making those, but can we have sort of these semi-permanent installations as well using biomaterials that then capture interactively some information? One example, I guess, I saw a couple of years ago at our school's grad show, creating what I would call a parallel coordinate plot, which is not a type of chart that most people are familiar with, but essentially having, every person who visited the grad show got a piece of yarn and they could tie it around a nail that was on a board and then move it and kind of wrap it around different nails. So, and these are all hammered into this board. So one would be like, what's your gender? The next one would be, are you a parent or a student or a staff member or a guest? The next one might be the age group. The next one might be where they grew up or something like that. And the more people who put the yarn in different parts, it kind of allows you to see different demographics in a really interesting way. And that collection and making it interactive and visualizing it kind of immediately without somebody filling out a form, I think allows us to interact in a really interesting way. And I think physicalization is a really interesting way of doing that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's something that I want to explore as part of my research as well, either as an outcome or a data collection mechanism. I haven't worked that out yet, but I see that as like data as art. But I like the term data physicalization. That's really cool, and I'm excited to follow along of your projects in the biomaterial space too, because I can kind of see that happening as well. And what you talked about that semi-permanent nature of the biomaterials, that's super fascinating too, and like fairly obvious, but think about it, and all these things that that are going to be obsolete in a couple of years, but then will exist into the world much later than that as well. And there's this really exciting. Now I'm just thinking. So we talked about some examples. Let's talk about. I guess, is there any examples that you can share that you have worked on yourself, and any, I guess, key elements when creating something that's impactful or a visualization or a project, and talk through some of those choices that you do have to make when you are creating impactful visualizations?
I guess it depends on what you mean by impactful. To me, how can somebody get something useful out of this visualization? For a while, I was in Queensland at QUT working on a project with some statisticians at QUT, and they were working with an agricultural company. And the way that farmers would try and support the supply chain, because they were selling product 3 years in advance, was they would phone each other up. and they would say, oh, we need to move these cattle from one part of the country to another part of the country. And being Australia, they were talking about, thousands of animals. And, to support the supply chain for 3 years from now. And the statisticians had a lot of information. They had satellite images of how far the cows might have to walk based on how much grass appeared to be around a cattle station. And they were making these kind of estimates. And there was, the stats behind that was really interesting, but turning that into something that was meaningful to a farmer who really understands their business. Like, I wouldn't imagine that I would possibly be able to understand the needs of what they do with all the user research in the world. So these people were experts in the way that they manage these their business and move these animals around the country. So I guess to make something that's impactful means that I'm able to provide something that is invisible to them. And the same with the sepsis project. Like, sepsis is a fairly invisible condition. Is somebody in the wrong triage category? That's something that's invisible to the clinician who's making that decision. So can visualization highlight something in a way that is otherwise almost inaccessible? And so working with this agricultural company on this project in Queensland, we were able to, do a lot of the stats was done by the experts in statistics, but I was working on building this interface that could then be used by farmers to say, well, the resources in this area, they probably have better resources. These animals need to put on weight at a certain rate and things like that. So moving them at this time and utilizing that knowledge and representing, where there might be some opportunities to call up, a person in one part of the country instead of another. Based on that data, but that became the opportunity in that one. And, I think it is really about finding those elements and framing those questions around, what is the actual problem here? Is it, that somebody doesn't know which other farms have a lot of grass at the moment? And how can we kind of represent where those opportunities might be for somebody in a business? Or, somebody has some of the hallmarks of a sepsis infection in a hospital that is otherwise invisible because that data isn't necessarily collected in the right way and put together in the right way. So I guess working with the experts, computer scientists, statisticians, really facilitates that data being shown, but it's just a mess without kind of that design process.
It's so interesting because that's another decision that is not something, we're not trying to elicit emotion from the visualization. We're providing information to make a decision. Because I've been reading a lot about persuasive data storytelling, which is quite different. It does influence, but in a different way. Whereas with a good visualization that's impactful, as you were talking about, highlighting elements that are invisible without the visualization, doesn't have to also be persuasive. It just has to then, provide that invisible information. So that's really interesting. And obviously there's so many different types of data visualization, why and how and whatever you'll make decisions. But it's interesting that we've really focused on ones here today that are making the invisible information visible to make more informed decisions rather than trying to elicit emotion to get somebody to change something or do something, like, say, the gun violence, for example. It may aim to persuade policymakers to, change gun laws and things.
And I think, the examples that I've worked on have mostly been what I would call utilitarian rather than creative. Or utilitarian rather than, going back to like ludic design, designing for people who have an entire person and do things like make music and read books that aren't necessarily utilitarian task-driven activities. And I think one of the key things about data visualization is knowing where you sit in what the requirements are for your users. I mean, data sketches, I'm so glad that it exists, but there is no utility for that other than the creators practicing their craft of writing JavaScript in most of those cases. And the fact that they share those is really fascinating. And it's not necessarily, like you were saying, it's not necessarily about informing someone, but it can perhaps help people make decisions. But I don't think that Periscopic's one is necessarily aimed at anyone. It's just we felt we had a need to create something, and they took a position on that data set, right? They were sending a message out into the world, and it wasn't necessarily aimed at anyone, which I think is another fascinating part of, the web culture and data visualization, that a lot of these visualizations, a lot of the ones by David McCandless from Information is Beautiful, a lot of the ones that are seen in, places like Museum of Modern Art, those visualizations that become artworks, they're not necessarily for a purpose, but not necessarily about self-expression. It's expression of something else, which I think is a really fascinating sort of approach.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think for the Information is Beautiful, for example, he's putting it out there, and people are using, potentially people are using them to then make their case for something else. But the initial purpose of why he's putting it out there is a creative expression.
Another example might be something more journalistic rather than utilitarian or creative. You've got kind of another aspect, like something like the Pudding, pudding.cool, a really beautiful blend of high-quality journalism, high-quality statistics, and very, very high-quality data visualizations as well. Again, this is another approach in that it's about creating journalistic narratives that people can engage with as they wish, and some of the topics are silly, some of the topics are fascinating, and some of the topics are really about sending a message, but not necessarily targeting any one group.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've given us so many amazing resources. Thanks, Phil. I've really enjoyed this conversation too. You got my brain pinging everywhere. Thank you for that. I think we've covered everything that I wanted to. I mean, we could talk for another couple of hours. I'd actually really love if you could share the paper on that heuristics evaluations you were talking about, that information dashboard as well.
Yes.
That would be amazing. But before we wrap up, any suggestions for listeners either using or interacting with data visualizations and storytelling in their work or life?
I think if you're working with data visualization, think about just starting to explore the data that is out there but not necessarily important to show anyone. I think the things like Dear Data, throughout the day, these are the doors that I went through, or these are the things I was thankful for, or these are the things, the times where I hugged someone or something like that. Those other things, I think they're just as important to be mindful of, and visualization's a fascinating way of approaching that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dear Data I read early on, and it actually sparked it was one of the key ingredients for me to start my PhD, actually, because I was like, oh my God, wow, this is such an interesting way to think about data. And like you said, data that doesn't necessarily need to be out in the world, which is a really interesting thing to think about as well.
But it's so great that it's there.
Yeah, it's so great that it's there. Yeah. I love that. Well, thanks so much, Phil. I really enjoyed this conversation. But yeah, thanks again. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes at zoeether.com/podcast. That's zoeeather.com/podcast. Have you got a question for me or one of our guests? We'd love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at hello@mysmart.community. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on LinkedIn too. And hey, ratings and reviews are always welcome. They help more smart humans just like you find the show. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode, as much as we enjoyed making it.